Yep.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Drew Jatomer, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Abby Reisman as this week's Brown Bag speaker. Abby is an associate professor of teacher education in the Teaching, Learning, and Leadership Division at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. I got to know Abby a few years ago through her work on studying teacher learning, and was tremendously impressed by the integration of a deep and practical knowledge of history teaching with impressive and groundbreaking theoretical perspectives on how teachers learn to support classroom history discussions. Abby did her graduate work at Stanford University, and she did stints at Teachers College and UCLA before landing in Philadelphia. Her work has appeared in Cognition and Instruction, Journal of Curriculum Studies, Teachers College Record, Journal of Teacher Education and Teacher Education, among others. And her accomplishments have been recognized with a number of national awards, including a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow Award. Abby's talk today focuses on instructional coaching for history teachers. Given the recent attention showered on the teaching of history, I can think of no more timely a talk. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Abby Reisman.
Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you. This talk is 2 years in the making. I don't know if people know the backstory, but it was originally scheduled for April 2020. And we all know what happened then. And then last year was a wash. I mean, things happened, but not this talk. And so here I am. And so I want to thank you, Drew. I want to thank Amy and Danielle for organizing this. And I'm really excited to present at this forum because it's called the Learning Sciences Forum, and historically the Learning Sciences hasn't had a ton of folks presenting from the humanities, and it's not totally absent, but I think it's less present. And so here it's terrific to have this opportunity in this community. Before I begin, I want to thank two doctoral students who I don't think are here yet, but Lightning J and Andy Del Calvo, and a master's student, Danielle Roof, have been so critical to this work. And so I want to acknowledge them. And I think one of them is texting me right now. So that's that. I'm going to be presenting new analyses here. These have not seen the light of day. And it's going to bring you deep into the weeds of history instruction. So buckle in. I hope the ride's not bumpy, but we'll see how it goes. But I really am very eager to hear your thoughts about what you see here. So history has been in the news, as Drew alluded, right? History has been in the news. There's new legislation restricting how history is taught. I have a lot to say about this. I think it's already having a chilling effect on the classroom. But I'm not going to focus on the political aspects of that today. What I want to really draw your attention to is how all of these pieces of legislation and all of this discourse is premised on a fundamental misunderstanding of how classrooms work.
Abby,
Yeah.
1 second. I'm noticing that you have the Zoom window open and it's somehow like it's on the slides. Yeah.
Okay. Is that a little better?
That is a little better. Yes.
Is there is there still a box there?
No, now it's sort of, we can still see the box, but it's at the bottom of the screen. It's not covering up anything.
You know what I'm going to do? I tried to do, I think I know what happened.
Okay.
So, how is that? Is that a little better, or is it the same problem?
Good.
It's good, but now you have now we can't actually see the Zoom. We can just see this rectangle.
Oh my goodness.
But
You were better before when you had it at the bottom.
Okay. Let's just do this then. And sorry, folks. Where did it go now? Hold on. Now I don't know. Folks, hold on 1 second. Oh, here we go. Okay, so hold on. Let me just. Three years into Zoom, and here we are. But okay. Do you see my screen?
None.
No, what? Something?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, we were.
Okay. Do you see my screen? Yeah? Yeah, we should
Perfect.
see it now. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, and is there a gray box over here?
Now there is. Now there's this
There
gray
is? Okay.
box at the
It's
top.
gonna basically keep me, I'm not gonna be able to see you. I have accepted it. Okay. I'm just gonna speak into the void, but everyone can see the screen, right?
Yeah, I think it's better now. I guess if you know, if it gets in the way, we'll let you know. We'll just move the boxes a little bit, but for now it's fine.
Okay, so just know that I can't see, and if I do this, the gray box shows back.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I can't see you and I can't see the chat, so just yell if something happens, okay? Just yell at me. I won't be offended, okay?
All right. Ravid and I'll take turns yelling at you.
Yeah, okay, I'm fine. I can handle interruptions. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the political aspects of this. What I want to talk about is how it's premised on a real misunderstanding about how classrooms work. Specifically, it assumes that if teachers just talk, students can be indoctrinated. If curriculum includes some particular content and it just exists in the classroom, that students will learn it. And this just runs right in the face of what we know about learning and what we know about how students internalize and construct knowledge and understanding. We all know that if students are positioned as passive receivers of information, that the classroom looks a lot more like this. So as a history educator, I've been working to transform that, to transform history classrooms. I work from a vision of history that's tied to student inquiry, in which history classrooms are places where students pose questions, seek answers in the documentary evidence, formulate arguments, where they understand that history is not a finished, dry story, but an interpretation of evidence shaped by one's perspective. And I believe that this type of instruction is paramount if we desire a citizenry capable of critical thought. This image that you're seeing here is a still from a video taken from one of the most talented teachers I've had the pleasure to work with. And it still took us 2 years of working together for her to set up this type of open discussion in her 6th grade classroom. That's a huge investment of time, and yet I believe it's essential. And all of my work and everything I'm going to present today is about how I've been approaching this problem. I initially approached this problem from the perspective of curriculum design. This is back in my dissertation work, designed the Reading Like a Historian curriculum that was then tested in 11th grade classrooms in San Francisco. It's now part of the Stanford History Education website, the curriculum, the SHEG, the Stanford History Education Group curriculum. And what this curriculum is comprised of are what I call document-based lessons. The document-based lessons at their core have a central question. The question is open to interpretation, and students are presented with 3 to 5 documents, 2 to 5 documents that offer conflicting accounts that they have to reconcile in an effort to answer the question. In a standard document-based lesson, the engagement with documents is preceded by some kind of background knowledge that assists students in understanding the content in the documents, and then it culminates in a discussion. Okay. The intervention was a success. I did this in 5 11th grade classrooms. We found lovely results on reading comprehension and historical thinking. But when I took a closer look at the qualitative data, the video data from the intervention, I did not find discussion. Discussions were rare, and student discourse really focused on just ensuring that students comprehended the literal words in the text rather than formulate broader arguments about the past. So in short, students were not invited into the processes of historical knowledge construction. They were not invited to formulate arguments that challenged accounts in the textbook or in popular culture, despite the fact that the materials were explicitly designed to that end. So there's going to be 2 video things. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. Okay, can you see this? Can someone say yes, if you can? Yeah.
Can you play it? I'm not sure we can see.
I haven't started playing. I haven't started playing it. I just want to make sure you see the outline. So before I play this is a 1-minute video of a teacher who's teaching a lesson on Napoleon. And the central question is, Was Napoleon a democratic reformer or a dictator? That's the question that they're wrestling with. And right after the video starts, the video starts right after the students read a document or documents. And the whole point of the discussion is for students to answer this question and wrestle with these conflicting interpretations, kind of consider whether the documents that they read are reliable or not. So here's what happens.
Okay. Let's finish up this class with a discussion of the sources and how they answer this question. So, document 1, I said it was reliable. Does anyone have a counter argument for why document 1 might not be the most reliable? Okay, we'll circle back around to that.
Wait.
Oh, you have one? Okay, we can revisit that one. So I put it in the reliable column. Document 2, what did people say? Reliable, unreliable? Reliable. Okay, let's get a hand, someone to explain to me why this is a reliable document. Okay.
Because it's his own words and like it's his letter that he wrote to his brother.
Okay.
His opinion.
Okay, so why would the fact that it's Napoleon speaking to his brother make it more reliable?
It's a primary source. Like it's its own version of his like words.
Okay, so I'm hearing some things. One.
Okay. So I find this video fascinating because this is not a teacher who is quizzing her students. This is not a teacher who's quizzing her students about, when Waterloo occurred or Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Okay, she's engaging them in questions about the document's reliability, which is a key question in historical thinking. But she starts with this question of reliability as if it's settled matter, right? I mean, you even see on the board, she's like, yes, document 1 is reliable. That's answered, right? In fact, document 2, which she also says is reliable, is a letter by Napoleon to his brother talking about all the wonderful things he's done for France. So I would say that's not a particularly reliable source if you're trying to figure out whether Napoleon was a democratic reformer or a dictator. By starting with this question of reliability and appearing to settle the matter, she effectively takes the interpretive power away from students by telling them which documents they should trust. Now, the literature suggests, there's a construct, PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, which explains what she's kind of not doing, right? She's not kind of asking these questions, these pedagogical moves that get at the heart of historical understanding, okay? But I'm less interested in why she's not doing it. Obviously, that's an important piece. I really want to know how we can get her to do a better job, to engage students in this really rich question, which kind of evaluates Napoleon's leadership. The answer that you hear casually, right, is PD, okay? But we know what PD often looks like, okay? Especially for social studies teacher who rarely get subject-specific PD. Like the history classrooms that we bemoan, these history professional development do not engage teachers in constructing their own understandings of how to teach history. So in thinking about how to transform the history classroom, I've had to necessarily consider how to design PD that does that, okay? And so, for example, you see me off in the corner here. What I'm doing here is getting teachers to rehearse discussion, okay? One of these teachers is actual discussion facilitator and the rest are pretending to be students. So I've been thinking about ways to get teachers to construct their understanding of how to best become very clear to me that these PD workshops are insufficient, that we also need coaching. That's, of course, supported in the literature on PD. So far, everything I've said does and could be applied to other subject areas. But here is where I need to really emphasize the challenges of even imagining what coaching could look like for social studies teachers. So first of all, the content of social studies is massive. Social studies is a broad multidisciplinary field that includes geography, civics, economics, not to mention essentially every current event. So like the history of Ukraine suddenly becomes social studies content for somebody who might be teaching economics. So even when social studies teachers are certified to teach in their subject area, their certification requirements may not include a whole lot of relevant courses. Second, districts deprioritize social studies, and there's simply less money devoted to social studies. In some districts, that means zero. And this has basically been the case since NCLB. Third, both of the above factors mean that there is very little research that gets published about social studies teacher education. So for example, I did a search in the last 4 years in the program of CUFA. It's a College and University Faculty Association it's the research arm of the National Council of the Social Studies. And I searched for the word coach. And I found 2 papers, one of which was mine, and the other was about the very common phenomenon of athletic coaches being social studies teachers. Okay, so that's sort of what we're dealing with. There is no research on historical coaching and coaching for history teachers. So this is the space where my current work exists. How do we develop coaches for social studies teachers so that teachers can be supported in doing this kind of ambitious history instruction? To do this work, I draw very heavily from the research on practice-based teacher education. This is a term that gets bandied about. The way I like to think about it is it has 2 parts. There's the part that says, if we're gonna work with teachers on ambitious instruction, let's distill some core practices. Let's bound some of the key instructional activities that we want teachers to do so that we can get them to collectively examine these practices, analyze them, adapt them, rehearse them. Secondly, if we want teacher educators to help teachers collectively examine, analyze, practice, rehearse these practices, they need a pedagogy for doing so. So let's take each of these in turn. So I was part of the Core Practice Consortium group. It doesn't matter. It's a group of teacher educators who kind of tried to think about what it means to bring practice-based teacher education into methods instruction. And a group of us put together this framework that tried to distill, again, when a teacher facilitates historical discussion, what are its components? We want to engage students as sense makers, orient them to the text, orient them to each other, orient them to the discipline. This builds on a lot of other work, Elham Kazmi's work, Sarah Kavanaugh's work, but this is our effort to kind of bound this practice.
I think you were muted.
Yeah.
When did that start?
I'm not sure. I think it was on the previous slide at the very end.
Yeah, just
Okay.
just 20 seconds ago.
Okay. So that's crazy. Okay. So in more recent work, I've further specified other practices, and this is going to really relate to what I present today, that are part of the document-based lesson. So for example, I specified that bit in the beginning where teachers establish background knowledge. I call it, now it's called an EBK. The teachers I work with, they talk about this like it's a thing, right? It's an EBK, and it's a 15-minute activity where you're motivating the inquiry, you're giving kids just enough background knowledge that they can get into the document. They also talk about an SHR. I did my SHR, it went kind of well, right? We're trying to kind of concretize these practices that are essential for the enactment of inquiry. An SHR is when the students engage with the documents, interpret them so that the EBK and the SHR get students ready for this final discussion. So this is how I've been thinking about the core practices. What about the teacher education pedagogies? Well, here I'm really, depend on Pam Grossman's framework, where, if we're going to work on practices with novices, they need to see multiple representations. They need some kind of analytic tools to decompose those practices, and they need to be able to approximate those practices. I'm also really taken by this model from the University of Washington, the learning cycle, that kind of fleshes out what this would look like in a professional development context. So you have the teachers are introduced to the practice, there's co-planning, and then teachers can enact it in their own classrooms and then analyze it together with whoever the teacher educator is. Sarah Kavanaugh recently went even further. She is worried that these teacher education pedagogies could be used to support kind of a mechanical technical pedagogy, right? I mean, we can imagine watching a practice and then rehearsing it and not emphasizing the instructional decision-making or reasoning processes. So she proposes these pedagogies of reasoning that really ask the teacher educator to pause in the middle of, let's say, a rehearsal and get teachers to see that the work of teaching is about making principled decisions, using their professional judgment, choosing among the many options they may have at their disposal to do something that's best for the moment. So if we take all of this together, and this is a little bit of a scary slide, but you might begin to see the work of coaching and the preparation of coaches as nested. This is, by the way, adapted from a paper I co-authored with some other folks in the Core Practice Consortium, but what I've added here is this outside blue circle. So let's start at the center. At the center is student understanding. And teachers need to have PCK, professional pedagogical content knowledge, to achieve this. They need to design and enact inquiry instruction that opens the discipline to interpretation. Teacher educators, let's say coaches, need to help teachers do this. They need to know how teachers learn, what some of the stumbling blocks might be that teachers encounter in order for teachers to change their conception of history instruction. But then what about me? I'm in that outside blue circle, right? What do I need to know as I work with coaches who will be working with teachers? Another way to think about it is Lindsay Gibbons' helpful distinction between instructional vision and coaching vision. She's really, what she wants to highlight is that just because you're a great teacher doesn't mean you're a great coach, right? You might have an instructional vision for what should happen in the classroom, but a coaching vision requires this teacher education pedagogy. And then I'm in the outside circle, and the work I need to do has to address both the instructional vision that we want coaches to do and the coaching vision that coaches need to develop to work well with teachers. Okay, so here we are. We have arrived at the project I want to discuss. The context for this project is a well-resourced suburban/rural district that I had been working in for 5 years. So the project is now in its 5th year. So this is 10 years ago. I was invited to the district to do a PD on reading like a historian curriculum. Over time, it became very clear that, one person is not a professional development model, certainly not a sustainable one. And the district, if it really was committed to this type of instruction, needed to develop a model to support teachers in this kind of work. And we decided to identify lead teachers to become instructional coaches. And we had to build out the entire model. What would it look like? So one thing that's important to note is what do we know about teacher leaders who are often tapped to be coaches? Well, first of all, nothing that we know comes from the history classroom, as I really want to emphasize, but we know some things, mostly that they struggle to give direct feedback. They need professional development and support, which kind of gets back to that difference between instructional vision and coaching vision. And we also know that we don't know many things. The project right now, as I said, is in its 5th year. But you kind of see how many teachers we've been working with. Shadow coaches are teachers who went through the program and then are apprenticed for a year, kind of shadowing a main coach. And so our goal here, though, is to really create a pipeline of coaches so that this becomes a sustainable program. Today, I'm going to focus on year 2 because that's our fullest data set for a number of reasons that you can probably imagine, given that the world kind of closed up in the middle of year 3. And the program, the kind of model that we ended up developing borrowed from or really built on this learning cycle from the University of Washington. So in a given year, teachers have 3 cycles with their coach. Each cycle is focused on one of these core practices, EBK, SHR, establishing background knowledge, supporting historical reading, and facilitating discussion. And what it looks like in year 2, and this has kind of shifted from year to year a little bit, but basically the teachers did these online modules. We kind of posted stuff to Canvas where they watched these videos and had some analytical tools for looking at them. Then they met with their coach to plan, and we tried to clump coaches and teachers so that when they rehearsed, there would be a bigger group, so that in year 2, we were able to achieve that. And then we used an online video platform, Torch Talent, perhaps you all know it. So teachers would upload, let's say, one EBK, get some asynchronous feedback from their coach, and upload another EBK. So that was sort of the model that they engaged in year 2. And my research questions really map right onto this. First of all, what do coaches highlight as essential for history instruction? That's really like, what is coaches' instructional vision? How do coaches work with history teachers, and how does their practice change? So this is now their coaching vision. And 3, what about me, right? What did I do with these coaches? Where did I succeed and where did I fall short in helping these coaches think about their pedagogy with teachers? So let's get into this. So the first research question is, what elements of classroom discourse do successful history coaches emphasize when planning with teachers? To do this, in year 2, we had baseline and post videos for every teacher. And we coded these, we scored these using SDI. There aren't a lot of tools for assessing historical discussion. There are no tools for assessing historical discussion. So we borrowed this. This is Jonathan Osborne's work on argumentation in science classrooms. It really, really fits though, because it's kind of agnostic to content. It really fits to argumentation in history classrooms. And what the SDI does is it segments a 15-minute clip from a lesson that has the most student discourse and scores it on 6 rubrics that each are discursive moves. So there are 3 teacher moves: ask, press, and link. Ask questions, press students for evidence, link student comments, and student moves: explain, claim with evidence and reasoning, co-construct, students build on each other, and critique, students challenge each other. So what we did is we scored the baseline, basically growth across this cohort of teachers, and found that they grew. We actually ran some t-tests and found that there was significant growth on 4 of the 6 rubrics. Ask, press, link, and explains. This was nice, but it wasn't really our main finding. What we did was we used this to select 2 high growth teachers and 2 low growth teachers, so that we could see, is there any difference between how successful coaches were coaching and how unsuccessful coaches were struggling with the language we want to use here. High, low is what we ended up doing for this. And then we coded those planning sessions with a code book that was sort of derived from SDI. And I'm not going to get into this coding, I can answer questions, but essentially it just maps on, right? If SDI codes press as a move when a teacher prompts a student to elaborate their point, we coded a coach comment as press if the coach prompted the teacher to prompt the student to elaborate on their point. So we had 2 hypotheses that seemed very obvious. We thought we were going to be bored. We thought successful coaches would probably explicitly refer to ask, press, link, and explain, because that's where their teachers did more. That's where their teachers showed the most growth. Secondly, we imagined that successful coaches would refer to ask, press, link, and explain primarily in the 3rd cycle. And we thought that for 2 reasons. One is that the 3rd cycle was closest to the post videos, right? And second, because SDI scored the discussion. So we figured that probably the discussion planning sessions were going to be where they worked on discussion. And we were wrong on both of these hypotheses. So what did we find? First of all, we found that the coaches almost never talked about press or link, regardless of whether they were high or low coaches. They just didn't talk about it. They also didn't talk about co-constructing critique, but that's not surprising because the students didn't do it. Secondly, we were very surprised to find that they talked about ask. Ask was the big difference, but the ask wasn't only clustered in the 3rd cycle that was focused on discussion. In fact, the ask was, and the EBK here is undercounted because we were missing an EBK planning session from a coach. So, I mean, again, I don't know what was in that missing file, but I feel pretty confident that that number would be at least a little bit higher. So it's the high coaches are talking about asking throughout all 3 cycles, starting in the first one that focuses on that first 15 minutes of the lesson. Then we took a qualitative look at the kind of asking that they were doing and found something even more interesting, which is that all of the asks were tied to this notion of an arc, that you're asking questions that are going to lead to the discussion, that what you're seeding in the EBK is going to come to fruition at the end of the lesson. So here's Henry. He's a high coach, H. This is him in an EBK planning session. He said, okay, so what you just did there, you identified a question that you would do in the discussion, like when they have the documents. Like what perspective is missing? Your discussion is going to go to that next level when you ask that. I'd save that for the discussion because then you've achieved that goal of really high level contextualization. Helena in the SHR planning session says, I know that this session is not focused on discussion, but I would really encourage you to try and teach this with discussion in mind. Like what big questions are kids going to be grappling with and how am I going to engage them in that? Because this lesson's really good to do that with. Like you've heard these two different accounts. You told me that Frick said something different than Emma Goldman. So who do we trust? Okay, again, kind of seeding this. This idea that we're using the EBK and the SHR to get to this, to build this final discussion. By contrast, one of the low coaches, and they didn't have a lot of ask codes, but this is the kind of ask code that one of them had. This is in the EBK session. She says, so something that I like to do when I run into that issue of not understanding why people would come over to the Americas is I like to show a map of Europe. And this could be from the time period or not. And I ask students, if I was a country and I was running out of resources or I wanted to be more powerful, what would I do? Okay. So there's a lot I could say about that comment, but the point here is that this is not a comment. This is not an ask that's tied to the arc of the lesson. This is an ask that's about a particular understanding that they want students to have. So what we see just from this analysis is that the instructional vision for historical inquiry involves the full arc of the lesson. Okay, that there's this real point that they want to emphasize that we're trying to build to this culminating discussion. It may be, and obviously we need to do more analysis here, but that focusing on questioning may have implications, kind of a cascading effect for teachers' press and link moves and for students' explain moves, right? Because we didn't see coaches talking about that. I mean, there was some explain, but explain has kind of, if you're going to talk about an ask move, it's pretty natural to then imagine what students are saying in response. But they were certainly talking about that less than ask. So there's this kind of, this is obviously we need to dig into this, but there may be sort of these benefits for other facilitation moves by just focusing on ask. And lastly, this point that instructional vision is not the same as coaching vision. Here, both coaches, even though they were high coaches, they were successful coaches, they are just talking at teachers. Right. So what we want to look at is, what else did they do other than just kind of telling teachers what to do? That's kind of the coaching vision, the teacher education pedagogy. So that's what we're going to turn to next. The next question is, how did coaches work with history teachers and how does their practice change? To look at this is a comparative case study where we picked two coaches, Mike and Melanie. And we're looking at their feedback in rehearsals because rehearsals are those approximations of enacted instruction. So if there's any place where we would frame teaching as decision-making, it's going to happen in the rehearsal. So we're looking, and we wanted to compare their rehearsals on the same practice. So we looked at their EBK in year 2 and their EBK planning and rehearsal in year 3. And we also looked at whether the teacher rehearsed it and then uploaded an EBK. So we looked to see whether the teacher picked up, kind of implemented the suggestions that the coaches made. So I think I just said this, but basically we coded teachers up EBK uploads for whether they took up the coach's suggestions. We coded the feedback in the EBK rehearsals for pedagogies of reasoning, for those 5 pedagogies that Sarah Cavan identifies that really emphasize teaching as decision-making and reasoning. So what did we find? First of all, starting with the teachers, we found that both coaches, both Mike and Melanie's teachers in year 3, took up many more of their suggestions as compared to their teachers in year 2. Now, these are different teachers. So this is like, can't make too much of this. These are different teachers, but still, they picked up more of their suggestions. So do with that what you will. What's interesting in Melanie's case is that she did a rehearsal with one teacher, but the other teacher who was present in the room but didn't rehearse also picked up those suggestions. Watching the EBKs of the teachers in year 3 and year 2, qualitatively, we also, the EBKs did a better job of motivating the inquiry, of kind of launching the inquiry, and they were just shorter by a factor of like 10 to 12 minutes, like significantly shorter. So I think what we can say, again, this is without interviewing the teachers or anything like that, but that there is some sense that this EBK functioned as a launch for the inquiry. Okay, so then what did the coaches do? How did these coaches change? How did their pedagogy of teacher education, how did their coaching change from year 2 to year 3? So one big difference is that their feedback happened in year 3 in the middle, in the pauses of rehearsal. It wasn't like the teachers did a presentation and then the coaches in year 2, what happened was the teachers would run through their EBK and the coach would give feedback after. In year 3, they would pause them in the middle of rehearsal. That was a big difference. We also found that Mike made instructional, he became more explicit about the purposes, the instructional purposes, and more explicit about his reasoning. Melissa did that too. She also in year 3 engaged teachers' relevant knowledge. I'm going to show you some examples of what this looked like. But importantly here, neither coach explicitly posed instructional dilemmas for teachers during rehearsal, and neither elicited and considered multiple instructional decisions. And I'm going to get to that later. But first, let's look at what they did do and how they changed from year 2 to year 3. So this is Mike in year 2, EBK rehearsal. The teacher runs through it. So his feedback comes afterwards. And he says, I like the fact that you ask the kids, what don't you know about this image? Because it gets them to immediately say, I need to look out for what the red scare is. I need to look out if someone says anarchist. Or you could even ask those questions like, hey, what's an anarchist? The other thing you have to consider is putting in the EBKs as high, low-level questions for socialism. Decide when you want to do that. I think it's clear that this is unclear feedback, right? Like, is the teacher supposed to ask, what don't you know about this image? Or is the teacher supposed to ask, what's an anarchist? And why am I putting in high and low-level questions for socialism? So there's a lot here that's missing for the teacher to really understand the feedback. In year 3, the next year, this is in the middle of a rehearsal about a lesson that's about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the lesson is really trying to get students to understand that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1892 is the result of both racial and economic factors. But this is an EBK rehearsal. So the teacher is in the middle. This is now, the feedback comes in the middle of a pause. The teacher is running through this EBK and is pretending to talk to students, right? And Mike is pretending to be a student. So the teacher says, anything else? We talked about cultural issues, race. What about economics? Mike says, pause. Are you trying to give away the answer? This is a trap. Just move on, like, okay. The teacher says, wait. So if no one gives me the answer, I just move on. So he's bothered that she's trying to pull out this economic factor. He said, yeah, just continue, because then it's more of a surprise, like a realization, like that's what you want kids to do. Like, oh, this is the Panic of 1873. He's saying, don't give it all away in the EBK. Let them discover that there are economic factors behind this legislation as well. Let them discover that the Panic of 1873 has something to do with it. Okay. Similar things happen with Melissa. This is a weird, this is, again, in year 2, she gives post-rehearsal feedback. She doesn't really interrupt their rehearsal. And the teacher here poses a dilemma. The teacher said, should I talk? This is a lesson about Mansa Musa and whether he from ancient Africa, Mali was, the question is like, was he the richest man ever? And don't worry about the lesson so much. It's not really important to get what's happening here. So the teacher says, should we talk about this pilgrimage thing before or after the blog post? Because the blog post mentions a pilgrimage. So the teacher's really wondering, like, when do I define what a pilgrimage is? And Melanie gives her an answer, but she says, I think you should have them read the blog post first. So she kind of talks about how to structure this. And then she says, because it's going to break up the fluidity of the EBK if you do this and then go to the blog post. And then she talks for a bit more. And then she says, afterwards, you can dive in a little, saying the reason it's important is because he's flooding the city with gold, because that's how we know how wealthy he is. So it's important to put it in as long as it's connected to the main concept of how rich is Mansa Musa. So she's trying to connect to the larger purpose of the lesson here. And I know this gets in the weeds, so don't worry so much about the particulars, but it's unclear. I think it's not as clear as it could be. And the teacher is asking about she kind of blurs this answer about when to define this term pilgrimage with this kind of structural question of the EBK, and I think that's tricky feedback to receive. Here's what happens in year 3. It's a lesson about the loyalists, and the loyalists from the American Revolution. The whole point of the lesson is did loyalists who oppose independence, did they have reasonable arguments? And so the teacher, again, like in year 2, the teacher initiates the dilemma. Did we decide if we're talking about the Continental Congress before or after the video? Melanie says, well, let's say we do include it. Are you leaning towards that? I would say, just because I want to make sure they understand, there's still people who are convincing the majority to try to work things out with the king. So you're leaning towards including. So right now you're thinking of including it. I guess I would, and here the teacher, they're in the middle of a pause. The teacher goes back into rehearsing the EBK. Okay, so we have a significant chunk who don't want to declare war. So what you're gonna see is the Continental Congress is gonna get together to try to figure it out. We're gonna watch a video so you can see some of that debate. Didn't we say you were gonna ask the kids what those arguments are gonna be? I would do that after the clip. And now the teacher goes again, kind of goes back into kind of acting out this EBK. And then Melanie emphasizes her point. And that's why I think keeping the Continental Congress is important, because you're right, they choose not to declare war. So something stuck about the loyalist arguments. So that's what we want kids to be thinking of as they're reading the documents. So I think a couple of things come out of this analysis. Coaches develop several pedagogies of reasoning. So that's good news, but they don't pose pedagogical dilemmas, and they don't for teachers, and they don't help teachers to consider multiple instructional decisions. I'm going to get to that in my final analysis. I know I'm at 12:45, but I'm gonna, unless you, I'm gonna keep going if that's okay, because I think the timing was a little off to start off. Do I have
okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm gonna keep them. The second thing I want you to pull out of these instances is that the coach's feedback is deeply embedded in the content of the specific lesson plan. And if we take point 1 and point 2 together, it has implications for teacher learning, because in the absence of emphasizing the decision-making process, it's hard to say what's transferable to other lessons. Like, this teacher is not going to have another moment where she has to decide to include the Continental Congress, right? There's the decision-making that needs to be made explicit, to kind of be lifted out, and that's what the coaches aren't necessarily doing. So before we go to this final analysis, I just want to highlight that these were the two things that Melanie and Mike were not engaging teachers in doing. And so now the question is, what did I do with these coaches? How did I work with them on teacher education pedagogy? And here I'm looking at all the video of the work I did with coaches. There was about 25 hours. I had like 5 of these 5-hour sessions with them. And I pulled out all the episodes of practice that were initiated by a representation of practice. There were 9 of these. They averaged 37 minutes. And first I coded for, how did I represent, decompose, and approximate practice? Like, just what did I do? But then I looked at those approximations, like when I prompted the coaches to do the work of coaching, and I coded that discourse for pedagogies of reasoning. Again, those 5 pedagogies of reasoning that Sarah Kavanaugh proposed. So again, it might be helpful to go back to this model. I'm trying to work on developing their coaching vision and their instructional vision. I'm trying to work on their coaching vision so that they can develop teachers' instructional vision. To the extent that these are aligned, my work is easy. To the extent that they're different, my work is trickier. So what did I do with them? I want to start by showing how I decomposed the practice. I created this very crude tool to help coaches think about their work. I suspected that they needed to first assess how teachers were doing in relation to the key goals of document-based history instruction. So, like, how are teachers doing? How close are they to these kind of core understandings? Then they need to figure out, like, well, what am I going to work on with this teacher in this moment? I'm going to work on lessons, learning goals, the historical content, kind of an aspect of general pedagogy, and then, like, how am I going to do that work? So this is like, I gave the coaches this kind of map. They're just like a handout with this Xerox, and then they kind of tried to map their response onto this heuristic, I guess. What representations did I use to support coaches in working on their practice? All of the representations were video-based. All of them were from the coach's own work with teachers. So videos from their own planning sessions, from their rehearsal videos with teachers, teachers' uploads to Torch, the debrief sessions they had with teachers. It's important because I did not, that maybe that sounds like obvious. Of course, I used their stuff, but there's other options. Like I could have had them rehearse coaching, right? Like I could have pretended to be a teacher and they could have been a coach. I didn't do that. I didn't do that at all. I didn't bring in videos of other coaches coaching with other teachers from a totally different context. So each of these would have had different affordances, and I think it's important that that's not what I did. And I think, I'm interested in seeing how these other tools might have yielded different learning. What approximations did I do? All of them were reflections on action after the fact. So again, I didn't have any kind of live rehearsals where the coaches had to think with a sense of urgency or time to action about how they would have responded to a teacher in the moment. What I did was I played like a video and I said, so how should or could the coach have responded? What could you have asked the teacher? When would you have paused this rehearsal? How would you give this feedback on Torch, etc. So coding all of these discussions for pedagogies of reasoning, what did I find? Again, I had to use these pedagogies of reasoning to develop their coaching vision, but their coaching vision had to include pedagogies of reasoning to develop the teacher's instructional vision. What I found was that I did use the pedagogies of reasoning to develop their coaching vision. Okay. When I did, sometimes it aligned with what they would need to do with teachers, but when it didn't, for example, the sorts of instructional dilemmas that coaches face are not the same dilemmas that teachers face. When they weren't aligned, I didn't explicitly model what coaches should do. So for example, a lot of the discourse focused on the instructional purposes, what a teacher does or doesn't understand about the lessons plan, its central problem space, the learning goals, the importance of a listening student voice. A lot of it was us just trying to figure out like how to get this teacher to understand this stuff. And that aligned, right? There's an alignment between what the coaches need to get the teacher to understand, what the teacher needs to understand. When I suggested a move, I made my decisions explicit and I tied them to these purposes, but that also aligns, right? There's alignment between what I was telling coaches or suggesting that coaches do and what they then would have to do, the teachers. That's what we were talking about. But there was less alignment here. I did engage coaches' relevant knowledge, and there's a lot of instances where coaches drew on their coaching knowledge to suggest even programmatic changes to the structure. They had a lot of great ideas. But I didn't explicitly model how they would engage teachers' relevant knowledge. So, you'll remember Mike didn't do this, Melanie did. I mean, it's not like, rocket science. It's really just the move of like, what would you do, right? Like just engaging teachers in thinking about what they would do, but I didn't explicitly model it. Even more clear is, although I engaged coaches in coaching dilemmas, like what would you do? How would you get this teacher to do this XYZ? I didn't model how to help them frame instructional dilemmas for teachers. Same with considering multiple instructional decisions. I did it for coaches' decision-making, but not for teachers' decision-making. And I have a short little video, but I think there's only about 9 minutes left for discussion. So I'm going to leave it here. And if you're interested, I can play it. But it's an illustration of what I'm saying here, that I highlight the purpose. We really talk about the purpose. I make a decision very explicit, but I don't model for coaches how to help them work with teachers to elicit relevant knowledge, to pose a dilemma and consider teachers' multiple decisions, options. So if we tweak all of this together, I think what we see, first of all, is that coaching for historical inquiry requires instructional vision. And that's based in a deep knowledge of curriculum and content. And this is so obvious and yet so important, because social studies teachers today are not coached by content experts. Really ever. I mean, unless it's in an evaluative context where their department chair comes into their room and looks at it, but they don't have opportunity for content-based PD. Secondly, pedagogies of reasoning are challenging but achievable for novice coaches. And I think to get to a better place with that, if we are going to train teacher leaders who are basically novice coaches to do this kind of instructional coaching, then we need PD that builds in pedagogies of reasoning on 2 levels, at the instructional vision level and at the coaching vision level. Finally, I want to just acknowledge, I warned you we would get deep into the weeds, but I don't want to lose sight of the ultimate goal here. It's the history classroom where the past is open to interpretation, where students engage with one another to build an understanding of what happened in the past and what it means for us today. And I honestly cannot think of a time when this work is more desperately and urgently needed. So thanks so much. I am looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Abby. Questions, folks? Oh, do we have, I don't see anything in the chat right now. Anybody have something to, a question for Abby? All right, let me try then. So Abby, so all of this work is deeply, as you said, deeply embedded in content. And one of the things you noticed, you pointed out was that many of the coaching strategies were were very tied to the specific content and didn't generalize. As you started moving to your support of the coaches, do you see opportunities of what kinds of things could ultimately become transferable, and so that we empower teachers to develop, and coaches and then teachers to develop their to develop these, even if we don't work on this explicitly teaching a particular content, area of content? So
transferable, who is doing the so transferable for coaches from lesson to lesson?
Yeah, and also, I mean, ultimately for the teachers, right? That they, assuming
so what would a teacher,
right, that assuming they have knowledge of the domain, are they able to bring this set of skills to new domains where they don't have to have like explicit coaching for these kinds of things?
I think that what the thing that was most transferable that I found was the step to figure out the problem space of the lesson. So if teachers, so those teachers, so I mean, it goes both ways right now. It's like I'm at all the different levels now. So let me just, and I want to make sure I understand your question too. But that seemed to me like the crux, the core move was that teachers had to recognize that there was where the tension was in the lesson. And then once they had that, then they could design instruction around it and kind of generate the discourse around it. But yeah, so that would be transferable. Is that what you're asking? Like what the teachers? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it starts at the planning stage, which is different than what a lot of the practice-based work would suggest, which is that there's a set of enacted moves that you learn, but those moves are just so embedded in the specific content of that lesson.
Right. Okay.
Other hands. Clark, should I go to Clark and then Kathleen?
Please.
Yes. At the beginning of the talk, you presented the example of a teacher who let some great opportunities slip by about discussing, although I do notice the teacher did ask a metacognitive question, although it didn't seem to get followed up on. So my question is, is that kind of talk part of what's sort of folded into the things you're looking at? And I'm also wondering particularly about teachers' growth, if any, on helping students to reflect on the nature of credibility and criteria for credibility, and how they make those judgments in particular instances.
I think one of the, okay, so first of all, what that teacher was doing. So that teacher, as I said, was doing some good things, right? I mean, she was asking them about, assessing the reliability of the source. I think that what she was doing though, that is not meaningful in isolation in history, right? And in that sense, she did it in a sort of IRE way where it was a closed question. This profoundly open question was rendered closed, right? And part of the problem, what I found, I mean, one of the things that I found, and it ties to Drew's question, is that this work starts, and a lot of the ways that this historical thinking work kind of enters classrooms, it's like, oh, we got to get students to source. Who wrote it? Do you trust it? Do you trust it? And the kind of discussion ends there. And where it stops is, I think, a pretty dangerous place. You know, that I know you know about, right? But especially in history, and I think we see this in the broader society, where like, oh, okay, you know, we can't trust anything, we don't know anything, sort of relativistic kind of abyss. And so initially when I started doing this work, I was like, oh, great, they're having these discussions, yeah, they'll get there. But actually, I think it's a really unsatisfying, I think, distressing place for teachers to not go to that. For like, this isn't, we cannot know for certain what happened in the past, but we have better and worse judgments that we can make based on this evidence. And the teacher cannot go into the lesson thinking that the ultimate goal is a he said, she said sort of back and forth. It can't be that. They have to have a learning goal about the past. So that's sort of where that.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting.
Dr. Riki.
Hi, thank you so much for running this session. It really is timely and an area I'm deeply interested in. Coming from New Jersey, the coaching concept seemed to be born out of the field of literacy. And there's been, I've worked with literacy coaches, and we moved that concept to math coaches. I'm thrilled. This is the first I'm hearing about social studies coaches, and the timing for this is so perfect. And there's a lot of intense focus on cross-curricular standards, right? And in working with literacy coaches, I always encourage them to help make those cross-curricular connections. A perfect place, social studies, literacy to start with. Have you done any research in terms of coaching in literacy, and what some of what has come out of that research, could it carry over to social studies coaching? And for an example, document-based evidence and working with that. I mean, that's something that's relevant, and critical thinking, critical reading, discussions. That's all in the literacy standards. And I'm just wondering, you know, with social studies coaches, should they also be looking at what's happening in literacy standards and in literacy coaching?
This is a longer conversation, but I'm just going to be totally transparent that I have a stance here that I am sure there are important practices that, I mean, these coaches could benefit from speaking to other coaches across the domains. But I think that the subject matter matters. You know, that's where I come from. And so there are some similarities, but the ways that you think about the text as evidence in making a historical claim about the past is just fundamentally different than the way that you think about a claim about like whether a character in a novel, you know, I don't know, I can't do that off the top of my head, but right, they have different epistemologies. So I think this is not to say that I don't think stuff can't be learned. I think there's a lot that would benefit from cross-pollination and working together. I absolutely, if anything, to refine what these different visions are. And you're right, there is nothing. I mean, this is like really, first of all, it's early analyses. I mean, you got a first draft of this work, so thank you for sitting through that. But I don't talk to anybody about this in history. Nobody's doing this. Nobody, I mean, that I know, you know, so it's, you know, I think yeah, we would benefit from working with literacy coaches.
I agree. This is the first This is intrigued, and I made sure this was on my calendar because I think it's needed and interesting, and just was wondering if there was any research in that area as well. But I fully support the idea and thinking that it should be subject-based.
Yeah.
A
It's
certain
a longer,
subject.
it's a longer conversation for how these, for where the alignments are, because there are alignments too, but
I don't know, I know there are a few more questions. Abby, I feel terrible, but I have to leave. I'm double booked here, but thank you so much.
thanks for
And,
inviting me. I appreciate it. Thanks
I'll
for
send
giving me
you
an
a note,
opportunity to talk this through.
Great. And I'll leave it to you, Danielle.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay here if anybody wants to stay and chat. This is such a good discussion. I know we have a question from Jessica, and I'm not sure if she's still here. Yes, she is. So maybe
I can take a look at this. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could just read it out. I think in the past Jessica hasn't read them out. So Jessica says, fantastic research. It was fascinating to see how the results of the study differed so much from the hypothesis. Did you and your team draw any conclusions to why coaches didn't refer to press, link, or explain? Do you want to take that part and then we can keep going? Or